Hey guys, it's your boy Reafi. We're back here again, and today we're going to be discussing Molly. So in case you guys are not familiar with the light/dark units, Molly is the light mermaid. So here's a brief overview of her skill set. Her first skill removes a beneficial effect with a 50% chance as well as dealing damage based on max HP. Her multipliers on this skill are also quite scary and high, so she does a lot of damage when built with decent crit rate, and you don't have to worry about attack or crit damage. Her second skill cleanses all harmful effects and places a shield that absorbs damage, which is proportionate to the target monster's level. So it is important to have all of the monsters on your team at max level. And her third skill is a passive which adds 20% chance to glance. This is actually the most prized possession of Molly on all attacks from the enemy on any ally unit. And this also includes herself, so don't think that this is kind of like Darien where it doesn't apply on herself. This does in fact apply to herself. She also heals the ally with the lowest HP ratio by 10% each turn. So now, to discuss the reason why you guys are here. How do we counter a unit that can render your attacks pretty much utterly useless? So immediately jumping right into it, I have heard so many different theories and explanations on how to quote-unquote counter her, but I'm just not satisfied. So to put that to rest, we're actually going to show the math behind it. When discussing percent-based skills, the best way to get to that average percent of the skill is by adding as many hits as possible. So this being said, there's a balance between too many hits and not enough. For example, with a unit that only hits once, their chance of glancing is in fact still 20%. However, if you do miss, you are missing out on an incredible amount of damage. When you get a glancing hit, you're not only missing out on 150% to 200% crit damage, which of course is dependent on what you have on your monster, and of course, on your attack power, etc., but damage is also reduced by 30%. So this means that the damage you get on a non-critical hit, that amount of damage, which you would get on a glancing hit, is then reduced by 30%, and that's the amount of damage that you do on a glancing hit. So in other words, roughly you're doing about 3 times less damage on a glancing hit, a little bit more than 3 times, based on my calculations, with around 160% crit damage with a decent amount of attack power. So it'd be even more. It would be even more than that if you had a very high damage nuker. You also can't land most debuffs, which means you're going to be having a tough time if you do glance with your CC monsters. For example, Varad, if he misses his glance, he will not reduce their attack bar or freeze them. But there has to be a balance between multi-hit monsters and single target nukers, right? Well, let's do the math. So with the 20% chance to glance, there's a distribution of damage you must understand when looking towards multi-hit monsters. So for these calculations, we're just going to assume that your monsters, all of these test subject monsters, are doing the same amount of damage for their AoEs. For example, we're going to be using Zyros, which does 1 multi-hit, or 1 hit. We're going to be using Amir, which does 2 multi-hits, and Charlotte, which does 3 multi-hits. And for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that all of them do an even 40,000 damage. So with a single hit AoE monster such as Zyros, with an average of 20% glancing hits, he will receive on average a reduction of 15% of his damage against the enemy units. Now this is over a period of tests with plenty of calculations where it evens out. What this basically means is, in a series of fights against Molly with 20% of your attacks from Zyros being glancing hits, you will do about 14 to 15% less damage in the long run. Now this is where it gets complicated, so try to keep up. Multi-hit monsters need a series of calculations since there are multiple scenarios for which they could glancing hit. For example, you could have it where they don't glancing hit, you could have it where they glancing hit on the first one but not on the second or the third. You could have it where they glancing hit on the first and second but not the third, or in Amir's case, he glancing hits on both, etc., etc. So the first example we'll do for Amir is double hits, so 2 hits. With a 2-hit AoE monster, such as Amir, that roughly does the same damage as the Zyros calculation, 40,000 damage, he will see a reduction of about 14 to 15% damage in the long run. With a 3-hit monster such as Charlotte that does the same damage as Amir and Zyros in the previous calculations, 40,000 damage, she will see about a reduction of 14 to 15% damage in the long run. Hopefully by now you guys see the pattern. Now, it was obvious to me that these numbers would be the same since it's still a 20% chance for all the monsters. So it doesn't matter if you're doing 1 hit for Zyros and 2 to 3 hits for Charlotte and Amir. Over time, given, plenty of trials, it's all going to even out to about the same damage reduction for all the monsters. Now this is average of 100 plus hits, plenty and plenty and plenty of hits. But what if we were to ask the question, what has more damage potential when given only a few trials? Because you don't have that amount of hits in an arena fight. You only have a few turns to decide on who's going to win the fight. So with a monster such as Zyros, he has a 20% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 12,000. That's when he glancing hits. But with a multi-hit monster such as Amir or Charlotte, the percentages are very, very different. Assuming the damage is split equally between all hits and these monsters all do the same damage. For example, Amir, he does 2 hits, so his 40,000 damage would be split 20,000 per hit. Amir has a 32% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 26,000, which means if he glancing hits on one of those attacks, and he has a 32% chance to glance one out of those two attacks, it will reduce it down to 26,000. So you'll notice that it actually reduces it quite a bit less. That is not more than half of the damage reduction, whereas Zyros, it's from 40,000 down to 12,000. And he has a 4% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 12,000. With Charlotte, it is even more different. Charlotte has a 38% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 31,000, a 10% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 22,000, and a whopping 1% chance to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 12,000. So what this means is Charlotte has a 38% chance to glance 1 out of her 3 hits, a 10% chance to glance 2 out of her 3 hits, and a 1% chance to glance all 3 of her hits. So in conclusion, while the numbers might even out in the long run in terms of the damage reduction that you receive on your attacks, the short samples do make a big difference. So the monsters with lower amounts of hits have higher risk but more reward, as those non-glancing hit chances are higher since, it's a higher chance to not glancing hit, which yields the 40,000 damage, in comparison, Amir's 64% chance to not glance versus Zyros's 80% chance. But the penalties are much bigger. So let's say you get that 20% chance on Zyros, your damage is reduced from 40,000 to 12,000. But for Amir, for that kind of damage reduction, that is a crazy, crazy difference. So for Amir, to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 12,000, it's a 4% chance, in comparison to Zyros's 20% chance. And for Charlotte, it's a 1% chance for her to reduce the damage from 40,000 down to 12,000. Now, of course, the multipliers on the monsters are all different, but we're not taking that into account because runes play a huge role in that, as well as damage multipliers, and there's not much we can do to that. When we're not talking about specific monsters, we are talking about multi-hits, Lucian included. So, if you were to want to be safe in terms of keeping your damage in a single attack, if you want to try to get the most out of your damage and play a safe run, you're going to want to bring multi-hit monsters. That means using stuff like Lucian or Amir or Charlotte or Rika or even Okeanos. Those types of monsters will not glance as often in short term, enough to where their damage is reduced pretty much useless, which it means glancing every hit 40,000 down to that 12,000. So if you want to play it safe, multi-hit monsters are the way to go. But if you are going up against monsters like Rina, where you do actually have to blast through with as much damage as possible, and hitting 20,000 or 30,000 damage is just not going to be enough, then yes, you're going to want to have more YOLO. Having that 80% chance to blast through and just destroy it while you can, you're just going to be able to do that better with like a single target nuker. So having Amir versus like Arena, where you're dealing the same amount of damage in comparison to something like Charlotte, you're more likely to deal the necessary damage to blast through a shield with your 2 hits versus Charlotte's 3 hits. So that is the difference between multi-hit monsters and single-hit monsters versus Molly in Arena. So I'll let you guys decide what you like best, multi-hit or YOLO it with single hit nukers. Let me know what you guys prefer in the comments below. I would love to hear what you guys think, but in the end, just remember, it all evens out to the same amount of damage reduction that you end up having to deal with. But of course, you could always just counter it in Guild Wars like bringing Leica. A lot of people don't like Leica, but the Fire Dragon Knight does not glance whatsoever, so that renders Molly's passive almost useless. Just food for thought, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I will see you guys next time.